series of books about Balin of Ibelin, one of which featured the Third Crusade as a major component of that book. Obviously, that's the last book, Envoy of Jerusalem. And I myself have recently finished a novel I've been working on about the Third Crusade, kind of focusing on Richard's crusade and his role in it. The name of the book is Richard and Saladin, the Lion and the Eagle. So those are our two books that we're going to discuss today. And, you know, my book obviously is brand new and yours has been out for a bit, Helena. I wrote a review of it and, you know, we did a lot of discussing about it back when it came out. When did it came out? When did it come out? Remind me of that.
2016.
Has it really been that long?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's 9 years. I'll double check the copyright. 16, yeah, absolutely. That's right. Yeah.
So let's, I wanted to, before we get into audience questions, and for those of you who are joining us for this stream, wherever you may be in the world, please do feel free to ask questions. We do want to make this an audience-driven discussion. If you have any thoughts on the Third Crusade, questions about the books, I know a lot of people who will be joining us are, you know, those who have read these books and been with us as, you know, part of this Real Crusades history journey for some time. So that's great. But really any question, the Third Crusade is sort of the topic we'd like to focus on for today. So if anybody has any questions about that specifically, that's very much welcome. But let's go ahead and before we get into questions, while people are coming up with questions, let's start off with some brief introductions of the books. And Helena, I'd like you to go ahead and tell us a little bit about some of the background of Envoy and the series in general.
Okay. The thing that makes the books very different, I think what I'd like to say first as an introductory comment is these books are very different. And our audience will like reading both of them. That we don't clash. We don't have substantially different views of either the main characters. Certainly we don't disagree on the facts and what happened. We both worked from the primary sources and the main secondary sources. They're both very solidly rooted in the historical record and in historical fact. What makes them very different is the perspective. And so let me go on to my entire Balin de Ibelin trilogy, or the Jerusalem trilogy, follows Balin de Ibelin, who is a nobleman born in Ottomea, and is a nobleman. He's born a second son, so he doesn't actually get his barony until after the battle at Montgisard. But he is a local baron, born and raised in the East, the Latin East. He never is in the West at any time that we know of. There's no record of him ever leaving the Latin East. He spends his entire career in the Latin East. And my focus on Ibelin and the people around him, his brother, his wife, who was a Byzantine princess, gives my trilogy the perspective of the natives of Outremer, the Latin natives, the Latin Christians. It's not from the Muslim perspective. It's not from the perspective of the Byzantine Christians, but it is from the perspective of the Franks who settled in Outremer. And this is what gives it a different quality from, as far as I know, any other book out there, and certainly from your book, J. Stephen. Doesn't make it better or worse. It simply is a different lens for looking at the events. The book opens with basically the fall of Jerusalem. The first two in the books in the series is they follow Balin through the Battle of Hattin when he wins his barony and he wins his bride, which is the Dowager Queen of Jerusalem, the Byzantine princess Maria Helena. And the second book, Defender of Jerusalem, follows the Balin and the Kingdom of Jerusalem through the turbulent 10 years in which the leper king dies. There's the usurpation of the throne by Gita Ibelin and Sibylla, and then the defense of Jerusalem. So Defender of Jerusalem, the second book in the series, describes the battle both of Hattin and the siege of Jerusalem, in which Ibelin plays that critical role of taking over the defense and holding on for, well, basically he even sorties out and forces Saladin to ultimately to negotiate with him. It was a very dramatic and really quite unusual defense, because he had 5 times as many women and priests as he had men, let alone knights, and yet he managed, as I say, to fight Saladin to a quasi standstill. He at least forced him to negotiate, which meant he was able to get most of the Christians out of the city as free men and women. Unfortunately, he was unable. He negotiated with Saladin a what do we call it? There's a Pauschal thing in German, an agreement that there would be a lump sum paid for the poor who could not afford to pay their own ransoms, because Saladin required a ransom for everybody he let go free. And there were more poor in the city than the funds that Evelyn had at his disposal. Evelyn then did the most Christian thing you can imagine. He offered his own freedom for the poor. He said, "Take me, hold me as a hostage until we raise the money in the West." And Saladin refused him. And that's where the Defender of Jerusalem ends. And Envoy of Jerusalem opens at this moment when basically almost in some ways the worst moment of Evelyn's life. The kingdom has been lost. His own barony of Evelyn has been overrun. His wife and children have managed to get out, but basically he feels this incredible burden for the Christians he was not able to get out of Jerusalem. So what was it, 8,000, J. Stephen? I remember. I think it was 8,000.
It was something like that. Yeah, it was in the thousands. Yeah, I don't remember the exact number, but
yeah, it seems initially it was 15,000 poor, and then the ransom over. They were when it actually came down to it, it turned out they were more than 15,000 poor, and I think it's 8,000 went into captivity and slavery. So the Envoy of Jerusalem looks at the Third Crusade, doesn't really start with the Third Crusade. It starts with the fall of Jerusalem, and it describes, of course, how Evelyn retreats then to Tyre. There's only one Christian city still in Christian hands. It's the fortress city of Tyre on the coast, where Montserrat, what's his name? Isabella's second husband.
Tyrone?
No, that's her first husband. Humphrey de Tyrone.
Oh, her second husband. You're asking these were the fortresses that were left?
The city of Tyre is held, I'm blanking out, by the
Conrad.
Conrad de Montferrat.
Montferrat, yeah.
And that's where Evelyn retreats there, and the two of them hold Tyre against two sieges by Saladin, and eventually the reinforcements come in. They then attempt to retake Beirut and try to go up the coast. They fail at that, and then finally the Third Crusade arrives. So the Third Crusade, in my Envoy of Jerusalem, basically arrives in the Holy Land. I think about 2/3 of the way, 40% of the way in. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, you still get the perspective when all of the subsequent well-known familiar events of the Third Crusade are still basically seen through the eyes of the native barons. And they have a slightly different agenda. They have different priorities than the Western princes who have come. And that is reflected in the entire book. And it ends finally with, of course, the end of the Third Crusade. And Evelyn, because of Evelyn, very importantly, and one of the reason that the title comes from Envoy of Jerusalem, Evelyn ends up being Richard's negotiator with Saladin. Mm-hmm. And Evelyn negotiates a peace which does not include his own barony. So that, again, it's a very bittersweet ending for Evelyn to be, when he manages to get some of the captives back, but he doesn't manage to get his own barony back. And the kingdom has been restored, but in a very fragile, weak state. And that is the story. And for me, Envoy of Jerusalem, I consider it one of my very, very finest novels I've written. I've lost track. I think it's about 28 now. And Envoy remains, for me, one of my best novels because while remaining very close to the historical record, it's much, much more about Evelyn's personal crisis of faith and his own journey. It's a character-driven novel, if you will, facing the defeat and coping with the defeat and finding a way to keep fighting and keep going. Okay, that's it in a nutshell.
All right. Yeah, that was a really good introduction. And yeah, I mean, it is a great book. I loved reading it, all those years ago. And I think that one thing, like you said, there's a lot of consideration for history put into both of these books. And, the events that we're talking about, whether leading up to the Third Crusade or the Third Crusade itself, these were trying times for the local Christians, the Christians who lived in these territories, but also just for Christendom in general. The sense of gravity of what had happened, the loss of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, this weighed heavily on,
Killed the Pope.
What's that?
Allegedly, it killed the Pope.
Yes, yeah. I'm guessing that's probably a bit more of a, sort of a later embellishment, but yeah,
Well,
I think it captures the seriousness of what was going on. But yeah, and just listening to you talk about Balian, and one of the things about this history is that you have the fact we were kind of getting into this a bit before we started, but the facts of this history are so much more interesting than a lot of the later stories, and even like the novelizations and fictionalizations of the Third Crusade that have come later. One of the things that got me interested in wanting to write my book in particular, which really does focus on it, it focuses on the Crusade itself and the events of the Crusade. It starts pretty much right when Richard gets there, and it ends when he leaves. And I remember when I actually sat down and studied that history, how fascinated I was by these events and how dramatic they were and powerful they were, and how they really, Richard himself and, Balian and a lot of these men involved were really admirable and interesting historical figures. That there was real heroism here in what was happening. And that is the thing that's so often kind of maligned or neglected, or even, outright lied about, I think, in some portrayals of this history. Like the idea is that, like, well, people like Richard or Balian were really motivated by wealth or personal motivations, or somehow this wasn't about the actual ideals that are articulated in the reasons for the crusade, but this was about some ulterior motive. And I think the thing that you realize when you study this history is that that's impossible. That's not what was going on here. What was going on here is exactly what people like Richard and Balian were saying that they were doing. And yeah, I mean, again, you mentioned that your story focuses on the perspective of the local Christians, the Poulains, as I think that's how you pronounce it, the local Franks who had settled in this region. And I did try to get some of that in there too. In fact, you really inspired me in some of our discussions when I was showing you the initial portions of the book, and you really inspired me to get more of Balian into the book. Just because of,
I'm glad.
I do think he is a really awesome figure, and I did want to get more of him in there. But that is a big thing in my book. I have this character who's a Poulain woman who had been the daughter of a knight from Jaffa. Her name is Stephanie de Saint Bertain. And she talks about how the event of Saladin's conquest had been the end of the world, like this apocalypse for the Latin Christians and for, all of Christendom in Palestine and Syria. And that is something I tried to convey in the story, is that this is the overcoming of the end of the world. When Richard and his crusade gets there, everything is gone. I mean, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, as it had previously been known, had been destroyed. All that's left is Tyre and a few little outposts. And the work that had to be done was restoring that, or rebuilding something. Really, to me, it's a new beginning type of situation. People always view the Third Crusade as this attempt to salvage something, and that's true to some extent. But really, they had to rebuild something that had already been destroyed. And it's the process of doing that, what they were able to achieve in doing that, I do think is remarkable and admirable. And it's amazing that those achievements could be viewed as just kind of a failure because Jerusalem wasn't taken. I mean, and that's it's understandable that that was a disappointment, and I think that was a disappointment. But it's kind of interesting because I think it was more of a disappointment for Christendom back in the West, like people hearing about it in France or England. It was more difficult for them to accept. I think for a lot of the Christians who were on the ground, people like Bailey of Ibelin, some of the local Christians. Yeah, go ahead.
We clearly have at the councils where Richard always called councils. This is a really important thing I like to emphasize every time we talk about the Middle Ages. These kings were not authoritarian and dictatorial. Richard made no decisions on his own. When he called a council, and throughout the Crusades, it was even when the noblemen agreed among themselves, they still called all the crusaders, because crusaders were volunteers. They were not vassals. Now, some lords came with their vassals, and then the vassals owed allegiance to their immediate lord. But the Crusades leaders, here in this case, Richard Lionheart, did not have the ability to order the crusaders to do anything. He could order his own immediate entourage, but he did not have control of the Duke of Burgundy or of Ibelin or the Franks from the local area, and he didn't really have control over most of the actually anyone. Technically, he didn't even have control over his own men, because they all came on crusade voluntarily and not in their capacity as vassals, but in their capacity as armed pilgrims. And consistently, Richard called councils, but this was also true in the First Crusade. They would throughout the Crusades, the leaders would call councils and they would seek advice, and they would listen to what the people, even the common soldiers, were saying. There are instances outside of Antioch where it was the common soldiers who insisted on continuing on down to Jerusalem when the leadership basically wanted to stay in Antioch. Let's call it quits. It's been bad enough. So that here, and when Richard called the council, it was clear that the Polains, that the Franks from the kingdom of Jerusalem advised against taking Jerusalem, and they did that out of sound strategic reasons, because they could not have held it after the crusade withdrew. It was too far inland. It was too isolated. The terrain between that and the coastal region was too rugged for them to have held it. So they wanted to get the kingdom back. It was their homeland. They wanted to be able to live in peace again. They wanted the ports. They wanted the coastal plain, which was the productive part. It was where the agriculture was. It was where the trading was done. It was where the base of their wealth. Jerusalem was nice to have, but when it came right down to it, even the Templars and the Hospitallers advised against trying to take Jerusalem. So you're absolutely right. It was the people at home that associated the kingdom of Jerusalem not with the people living there, and not with a living thing, but with this symbolic Jerusalem, that were most disappointed.
Yeah, and that's one thing I wanted to really get to with my book is I think a lot of the decisions that Richard made, and like you're discussing, these decisions weren't made in isolation. He wasn't a dictator. That's an intriguing thing about European Christian society in the Middle Ages in general, is that it was so not a dictatorial type environment. I mean, far from it. The modern world has so much more of an example of just dictatorship as a leadership style than we do in the Middle Ages. But I do think Richard. One of the things that some military historians have pointed out is Richard's concern for his people. Like as a style of general, he was concerned with ordinary soldiers. And I think a lot of the decisions he made in his crusade were oriented toward the good of the Christians of the region. And you can see how that could be a little bit different from, okay, well, Christendom wants Jerusalem. We have to have Jerusalem, versus, well, the Christians here, they need X, Y, and Z. They need these ports. They need some sort of stability. They need to be put back on their feet, which is really what, we think about the Third Crusade. The Third Crusade was called to reclaim Jerusalem. Well, really with the Third Crusade, the work that actually had to be done was the Latin East had to be restored. And that meant putting the Christians who actually lived there, because this wasn't just a pilgrimage destination for these people. They lived here. They had a life here. They had to be able to work to defend this territory. That meant putting them back on their feet. And to me, it's a mark in Richard's favor that when he arrives, he recognizes this very quickly, and that's what he sets out to do. And that's in contrast to some later crusaders like Frederick II, who show up and just view the whole thing as a vanity project.
Yeah.
So again, that's a mark in Richard's favor. And this is a problem with the way that pop culture views Richard the Lionheart.
Yeah.
It's the opposite of what he was like. You know, the pop culture portrays him as this crazy, bullheaded man who just shows up and wants to start swinging a sword at things and killing stuff and killing Muslims. And that's not at all his attitude. His attitude was the opposite. His attitude was to really think about the situation and figure out what needed to be done for the overall good.
But the other thing that really impressive about Richard, he was extremely clever in finances, and he was very, very good in diplomacy. And a lot of his victories in the West were with clever maneuvering, but his astute finances enabled him to finance a crusade on a scale that was unknown. He ensured that his troops had their own fleet. You know, Philip's chartering ships, and most of the time the Crusaders had to drag their bodies across 2,000 miles of hostile territory. And Richard pays for a fleet and transports his soldiers right to the front. That's twofold. One, it's making sure he has the most effective troops, so it's wise, it's strategic thinking. Two, it's good for his men. It means that they're going to be alive and healthy when they get there. And three, the fact that he could afford it was because he was so good at organizing the financing for this. Richard is anything but a hot-headed idiot. And his strategic approach, once he gets there, as you say, on one hand, it is understanding for the people there, but it's also because he has a long-term perspective. He sees, okay, I didn't get Jerusalem today. That doesn't mean I can't take it tomorrow. Richard doesn't know he's going to die in 1199. We know he's going to die in 1199, but he doesn't know that. And when he leaves, he firmly believes that he'll be able to come back and finish the job.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing that's interesting about the Third Crusade is that it does set up the Latin East for success in the 13th century.
Yes.
You know, if the victories of the Third Crusade hadn't been achieved, and one of those that's important is the acquiring of Cyprus, which is which is yet another important achievement of the Third Crusade. If that hadn't been done, then this flourishing of 13th century Outremer would not have happened. I really think that, this idea that Outremer was just in decline and the Third Crusade was just one, step on the way to that until a century later we get to 1291 it's an erroneous view of it, because really, I know a lot of historians, they point this out when you read just mainstream history about it. In the early 13th century, the Latin East is flourishing. The restored kingdom of Acre, if you want to call it that, was a flourishing and important power in the region.
Yep.
There
was nothing inevitable about the defeat of the Latin East. They're brought down by a bad alliance, essentially by allying with the wrong sultan. But it's not as there was nothing inevitable about the defeat. I've written a lot about that.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the problems that came later, a lot of them start really with Frederick II, I think, and I know you and I agree about that.
Yeah.
So, okay, so we've kind of given a bit of an introduction. I want to let everybody know, if you're with us and you haven't gotten these books yet, there are links to pick them both up on Amazon in the description box below. So you guys can get them both, and they can be like you can read them as companions. So there you go.
I really, they can be read as companions because they're so different and yet cover the same. If you like the top, obviously if you're not that keen on the topic, you don't want to read two books on the same thing. But if you're really interested in the Third Crusade, I think you'd enjoy seeing how they mesh.
Yeah, I think they kind of. They definitely focus on very different aspects of the Third Crusade. I mean, obviously yours isn't just about the Third Crusade. It's about Balian's career leading up to that as well, which, is really fascinating stuff. And again, I see a lot of similarity in figures in the figure of Balian and Richard. These are two men who, embody the virtues of knighthood from this period, I think. And that's not just a romanticized view of it. It's the real thing. I firmly believe that. And I think that the evidence shows that. So let's go ahead and look at a couple of questions here. And if anybody has any questions, do get with us about that. So I'm looking through the questions right now, everybody, and I'm going to really focus on the ones that are on our topic. Some people are asking things that are pretty different, or, just a different area of discussion for, these medieval topics. So let's go ahead and focus on the Third Crusade. And that's really what I'm going to look at right now. So Christopher Green, I've seen in pop culture that England is sometimes portrayed as bankrupt following the Third Crusade. Is there any truth to this? And what was the state of England after the Third Crusade? And that's a really good question. Something I actually was discussing with someone about recently. I'll go ahead and say a couple of things. England was not bankrupted by the Third Crusade at all. In fact, there's really no reason to look at the Third Crusade as some kind of, it was a hugely expensive undertaking, but it's almost like saying, right, for the crown. Like, was the United States bankrupted by the Iraq War or something? Powerful countries can do these types of things. England was a very wealthy and very prosperous state, and it was more than capable of handling the expense of the Third Crusade. I don't really see it. Yeah, go ahead, Helena.
It's really fascinating if you look at what Richard did to finance this crusade, because it was the English crown that the individual crusaders could have bankrupted themselves. One of the things that we've really talked about, I think, in other times, Stephen, is that going on crusade was expensive, and people actually often went into debt, or they sold off properties to be able to crusade. And this is why this fantasy that they were younger sons and poor people who went to make their fortune is rubbish. They had to be rich to go on crusade in the first place. So individuals may have been bankrupted. Okay, we can't exclude that. In any endeavor, people were bankrupted going into business. People were bankrupted, going on other crusades, whatever. That's not the point. The point was England as a whole. In other words, and that comes from this idea that there was a Saladin tax and that people were taxed beyond their means by the Third Crusade. It's not true. Richard financed the crusade primarily by doing two things. By selling off royal properties, for which he was severely criticized because it reduced his heirs' wealth. In other words, it was considered it was sort of against the feudal code to sell off lands because you impoverished your heirs and the people who came after you. And that was something feudal lords were not supposed to do. But it was impoverishing the crown. It was not, he was selling property off. People bought property because they wanted it and they could afford to buy it. The other important means that he used for financing the crusade was to sell offices. It sounds horrible in the modern language, or it should sound horrible in modern times, because we don't think of offices as being for sale, although they are now again. But in the medieval time, that was normal. That was called patronage. You sold off a wealthy abbot, got his position basically by buying it and outbidding others. Bishops were appointed by bidding fire. Cardinalships became largely, we think of it as corruption. It was normal. And Richard was selling off the positions of sheriff here and, whatever there. And it was perfectly legitimate. And the people who bought those positions had the money to do so. And Richard got his coffers from his crusade. So you can like or not like the methods he used, but it was not a matter of the peasants of England having their last bit of grain torn out of their pockets and starving to death. Right?
Right. Yeah, that's nonsense. If that was what was needed to make it happen, it would not have happened, because that would mean the state couldn't support it. When states engage in these elaborate military campaigns, it's because they're able to do it. And in England's case in particular, I think at this period of time, England was one of the wealthiest and, most tranquil places in Christendom. I mean, this was a wealthier place than, like, say, most of the Holy Roman Empire, or, the farther east you went. And life was good in England at this time. I mean, it was away from the war between the Angevins and the Capetians, for one thing. It was the most tranquil and prosperous part of the Angevin Empire.
Yeah.
And this is kind of related to your question, but I'll hear people say, well, Richard's ransom, he was captured by the Holy Roman Emperor and his ransom bankrupted England. That's also not true. It cost a lot of money to the wealthy people in the kingdom. But, when Richard got back to England, England was still very much one of the wealthiest and most powerful places in medieval Christendom. And by the time of his death, John Gillingham says that England was more prosperous and in a better state than when Richard got it. So I think that's noteworthy too. This idea that somehow Richard, through reckless finances, wrecked England. It's just not. Yeah, it's the reverse.
It's
exactly.
Absolutely reverse. He was one, as I said, he was almost sound. His father was also very sound. I mean, it's interesting that people thought he was in better condition because his father actually instituted a lot of reforms that helped put England on a sound financial basis. Henry II is one of England's greatest kings, and Richard could build on an administration that was already functioning very well, and it was very, very strong. But he also did things. I mean, when he sold Cyprus, he gets the Templars. He conquers Cyprus in 6 weeks and then sells it to the Templars and gets fortune for it. This is a guy who knows how to replenish his coffers, not deplete them. And if his state was if England was in a better state, I would put that down to probably the wars with the Capetians had just cooled off somewhat. But anyway, both his father and Richard were very, very savvy in their use of financial resources.
Yeah. I think some of this points to misconceptions we have about the medieval world. This idea that it was just this barbaric place where peasants were, stripped of every bit of their wealth. It's a caricature. It's the Monty Python version of history. And when you really study this period, you realize how sophisticated, the administrations were, and the way these governments
legal
function.
Systems.
The legal system, yeah,
very, very complex.
In a lot of ways, the way the world is run now makes you wonder which was more sophisticated.
So many of what we think of as critical legal principles, equality before the law, the basic principle of having defense, the right to defend yourselves, jury before your peers, are all medieval concepts.
Right, exactly. So let's do a couple more questions here. This one is, I think it's closely enough related that I would like to address it because it's kind of interesting. Beat Reporter says, why was there never a military campaign crusade from the West while the Kingdom of Jerusalem was at its height of power, unity during Amalric or the lepers' reign? I'll let you go first with that one, Helena.
Well, because people didn't think that was necessary. When everything's going well, it's like they have their own problems at home. It's, England first. And why should we worry about that? They went on crusade when there was a crisis. So when things looked like they were going very well and the kingdoms, like Almaric's invading Egypt and they're expanding, obviously they don't need help. So why should we go there? And actually that's,
right.
As a crusade. Now, many individuals did go. Throughout the period of the crusade, tens of thousands of people every single year went on pilgrimage to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Many of those were armed men, whether of the sergeant class or the knight class, and they would routinely take part in any campaigns that happened to be on. So if the leper king was decided it was raiding into Saladin's territory, which he did multiple times, many of the men in his armies would have been armed pilgrims who happened to be in Jerusalem at the time, as I say, whether of the knightly class or less. So people did take part, but not as an organized campaign led by a ruler. Rulers had a lot to do at home. It was very dangerous leaving your kingdom for long periods. Bad things could happen, like your brother might take over. And so kings were very reluctant to leave their countries. It was also against their feudal duty. Their duty was to their subjects. They were supposed to be governing and providing justice and security. They were not supposed to be campaigning at 2,000 miles away. So they're not going to do that if there's not a crisis, if there's not, the Pope telling them this is God's will. Christ has been taken hostage by the Saracen, and it is your duty as a Christian to ransom him by going and freeing him, which is, of course, the motivation. It's one of the arguments for the First Crusade, and that comes up again for the Third Crusade.
Yeah, I think those are all good points. In some ways, this was one of the problems that, unless there was a serious crisis at the moment, Latin Christendom would, I think Christopher Tyerman always puts it as the Crusade was the next thing to get to. It's and even then sometimes it was, but it's
that's very good for Henry II. I promise I will do it. Believe me, I'll do it. But first,
I'll tell you,
first I have to take care of Philip.
Yeah, and once you become a parent, you can really understand that kind of thinking. But people. There was a lot going on at home. It was ideally, there should have been more of a program throughout Latin Christendom to kind of keep this constant level of reinforcements there at a certain level. But unfortunately, that sort of mechanism just wasn't in place. And there was, I think, like Helena's saying, some tendency to think, well, actually, things are probably going pretty good, But anyway, I think we kind of addressed that enough. This is a good comment from Caleb. I think that's you, right? Kaiser of History. I could not recommend these books enough. Thank you so much, my friend. And then he has another great comment here where he says, I have read all of them, and there is a great deep dive history section at the end of every book for nerds like me. So that's good. Thank you, Caleb. I'm pretty sure that's Caleb's handle there. It looks like him in the picture. Let's see. I'm going to look through some more of these questions. But if you guys haven't picked up your copies, links are down below in the description. I'm just looking for stuff that addresses. General Grievous here says, I do think the Third Crusade can overall be classified as a Crusader victory. I think that's fair enough. Yeah,
absolutely. It was a huge victory. I mean,
it was.
It reestablished a viable state. And that's what I think there's a tendency, I guess, for people in retrospect, with the wisdom of hindsight, to treat it as though it was not viable. In fact, it was viable. Mm-hmm.
Right.
As I say, and there was actually no need. It could have survived. I don't, we can start getting into what ifs and Chris Christie speculative things. If the Mongols had really pushed on to the coast, it would have taken probably the united forces of the Muslims and the Christians to stop them. There's things that could have brought it down, but there was nothing inevitable about its fall.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about history in general, is it really shows you something about the nature of reality itself, and that small things can lead to big changes that you never. And as you get older, you realize this for you youngsters watching this, and that's the history of the Crusader states. I mean, there are small decisions that are made that have either good or bad results down the road, and a lot of the decisions that Richard made had good results down the road. But later on, there were people who made decisions that were disastrous for the Crusader states, and Frederick II is one of them. I still really look at that period. Frederick II's intervention, the Sixth Crusade, which supposedly was this big success. That a lot of people like to say.
Horrible.
It was
horrible.
Yeah, it was a disaster for the Crusader states. And
start with the fact that he was excommunicated, and the Pope did not call it a crusade. It was an anti-crusade. I mean, get back to the nomenclature. We talk about crusades. People talked about taking the cross and armed pilgrimages, and there was an understanding. But even then, the concept of an of a military campaign to the Holy Land required papal sanction, and the Sixth Crusade did not have it, and nor did the Fourth.
That's true. And then Chris over here says, did Frederick's death and Philip leaving doom the Third Crusade? Those are good topics. I would say that Frederick's death was a bigger loss than Philip II. Yes. Yeah, because Philip II's army mostly stayed, which is interesting.
Right. And if as long as he was there was two leaders. Once Philip left, the French basically followed Richard, or at least he had a chance of convincing. He had a fair chance of talking them into going along with him. The question is, doomed it to failure. J. Stephen and I are saying it wasn't a failure; it was a success.
Right. Yeah.
Are we talking about Jerusalem? Could they have taken Jerusalem if Frederick Barbarossa had been with them? Maybe, but they couldn't have held it. The problem would not have changed. The issue remains that crusaders come and go, and you have to hold Jerusalem with the people who are there. And so could they have taken Jerusalem? Possibly. Could they have held it in the long run without more settlers, without more permanent troops? No. How do you get more settlers and more permanent troops? Could you have had incentives if they took enough land that they could give away new baronies, if they took enough land that they could control some of the outlying regions? They could have become viable, but I don't think 15,000 more men that were on a short-term vow were going to make that difference to the viability of Jerusalem in the immediate in the decade immediately after its capture.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's interesting too, because a lot of people assume that when Frederick Barbarossa died, that was the end of the German Crusade. But actually, most of the army kept going. It's not like after he died, everybody went home. There was I don't remember if it was
Conrad of Swabia took over.
Yeah, his son took over, and there was disease later that really devastated the army, and that's actually what depleted a lot of the numbers. But Frederick Barbarossa's crusade is another really interesting topic, and again, it's one of those that's kind of misunderstood because he defeated the Byzantines and the Seljuk Turks before he ended up, dying in this.
And he did it with very few casualties. He swept through. It was a brilliant campaign. And that's now the question for you, J. Stephen, is would Barbarossa and Richard have been able to get along with one another? Would two such strong personalities have gotten along, or would have they ended up bickering? I mean, Philip and Richard detested each other from the start, and they were bitter enemies. We know that. But Barbarossa, I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, my opinion is that they would have. And my reason for thinking that is because they both had the same motivation. I mean, there's strong reason to believe that Frederick Barbarossa was very sincere in what he was doing. Obviously, he had taken a vow that he was going to, get to Jerusalem and liberate Jerusalem, and that is emphasized over and over again. Each grueling step of the way, and I think that I think that's what he was trying to do. I think he was a sincere crusader. I don't think the tensions that existed between Philip and Richard would have been there. It's kind of hard to say, but
well, they wouldn't have been the same tensions because, as I say, with Philip and Richard, those were long family tensions, including wives and sisters, and the whole mess of the Capet Plantagenet struggle. That certainly wouldn't be there. You do have, though, two strong commanders. I guess what you come down to is they would have had to, like Richard and Balian, if they agreed on the strategy, they probably would have been, practically invincible. And if they quarreled about a strategy, it would have been bad. Yeah. But given they were both very intelligent, strategic thinking men, there's more likely that they would have agreed with one another.
Yeah, I think so. I think, just looking at Frederick's conduct on his crusade, you can kind of see that he had a similar attitude to Richard, and that he did what made sense. And I think
And
it
he
would
was
have been
prepared to pay for his soldiers. I mean, he'd also
yeah,
his campaign was well financed. He
right.
was not going to go and plunder his way through the Byzantine territory. He was prepared to pay. They planned on it. They could have been a very effective team. In that sense, maybe they could have taken enough territory to make the holding on to Jerusalem viable.
Yeah, the thing that really the local Christians emphasized to Richard was that they needed Kerak and those Transjordan castles, and I think Richard really he was listening to that kind of thing. That's why he wanted to get Egypt, because he wanted to basically decapitate the Ayyubid snake by taking out Egypt.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, maybe if they could have, if they'd had 15,000 more men and they could have crushed Saladin's army even more thoroughly, maybe it would have been possible to get some of those castles. But that's getting pretty speculative, obviously. Okay, so let's see. So was Richard's naval fleet that followed the infantry during their march harassed by Fatimids? We never hear about any Islamic nations fielding navies. Why was this?
Oh, well, they did. They certainly had navies.
Yeah.
There was a famous fight between the Ark was being supplied by ship, and the Arabs controlled much of the early history was of the Arab, and much of the later history. You think about the Hospitallers, was the Arabs controlling the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, and their ships, and I mean, we consider them pirates. Otherwise, they were pirates and slavers, but they had ships and they had navies.
Yeah, and we have to remember that the Fatimids were gone by this point because Saladin had eliminated the Fatimid Caliphate. So he controlled the Egyptian fleet, but yeah, that was his fleet, was the Egyptian fleet. When Richard took Acre, that basically wiped out Saladin's fleet because most of his fleet was there. So, well, it's kind of two phases. When there was that naval battle outside of Acre, when Richard was first arriving, they destroyed a lot of Saladin's fleet then. But then once Acre fell, that pretty much finished off Saladin's fleet. So that was an important achievement. I mean, yeah.
But that's again, I think one of the great historians mentioned there has not really been a naval history of the Crusades, and there should be, because the navies played a huge part. They played an incredible part in the very beginning, in the early years of the Crusader kingdoms, when they were taking the coastal cities. They did that largely by land and sea blockades, and they needed ships to do it. And of course, we even have Norwegian kings, Haakon, coming down and fighting in the Crusade. What happens in the early part, in the era of the Crusades, mostly, is Western naval architecture was superior to Arab naval architecture. The Arabs were still using the Latin rig, and the Christian ships also had the central rudders, not side rudders. I'd have to go back. I'm not. Please don't quote me on this right now. But I've read about it, and I also agree it's something that has been inadequately written about and explored, because it appears that actual control of the Eastern Mediterranean, of course, once you got control of Cyprus, but also, as I say, superior naval architecture, was at the period of their Crusades. They lose that again. I mean, you have, as with all technologies, one side gets ahead and the other then catches up and then goes beyond it. But there was a period where the Christians had clear superiority at sea.
Right.
When Louis VII comes in, his fleet very much dominated the Eastern Mediterranean.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big component of the story of the Crusades. The increase in Latin Christian naval power. I mean, the Italian, powers were very important in that. So and like you're saying, that's an intriguing aspect of the history that's undercovered. But yeah, Richard's, his fleet allowed him to dominate the coast, and that was a huge advantage for him. I mean, and Cyprus becomes a big naval base. So
yeah.
And then Titans of History says, to what extent did native Christians in the Levant help the Crusaders? Did the Maronites assist them in any way, especially prior to Richard's arrival, when all they had was Tyre?
but the Maronites, the native Christians supported the Kingdom of Jerusalem. They identified completely with it. They supplied a large portion of the armies. People, again, they don't understand. These armies do not just exist of knights. They had armed, they had mounted archers, which are almost all native Christians, and they had sergeants. They had archers, foot archers, and foot soldiers, who were almost all native Christians. There were, of course, sergeants. There were, of course, Latins who held sergeant fiefs. There were, but the population, the Latins never made up more than about 1/5 of the population. 80% of the population were native Christians or Muslim, and those people were providing 80% of the armed forces, and they were fighting, side by side and dying side by side with the Franks and the Crusaders. They supported it in every single way. There's some beautiful laments for the loss of Jerusalem, for the loss of the kingdom, where they talk about our army and our troops and our people. So yes, the local Christians supported the Kingdom of Jerusalem itself, and therefore supported the Third Crusade, which came to its aid.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, this is kind of getting back to some of the misconceptions about this period, that, native Eastern Christians, we think of Syrian Christians, Arab Christians, Greek Christians were a huge part of the Crusader states. And the Turcoples, which, as Helena was pointing out, these are native Christian archers or half native, and again, that's another interesting thing to point out, is that intermarriage was such a big thing that by the time of the Third Crusade, you've got entire groups of people who have dual heritage, or, both Eastern and Western heritage. And these people are, a part of the society. They're taking part in the crusade. This is their cause as much as it is the Latin West cause. So
not more so. It's their home. It's more so.
Yeah, more so. Absolutely. Yeah. There's a really good, one of the most interesting episodes from the Third Crusade is this night raid that Richard does on Saladin's Egyptian convoy coming up to supply his army. And what facilitated that was the Turcoples and their spying techniques, and also their ability to move swiftly in and surround this convoy. The Turcoples,
there are estimates that 50% of all mounted troops were Turcoples, not
absolutely
Alawite knights. They were two wings. It was like light cavalry and heavy cavalry. It's like the dragoons and the hussars.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this hour is just flying by, but we have quite a few questions. I'm going to jump into a few more of these here. This is a good comment from Sam. Sam is very knowledgeable of this stuff. England's tax problems in the early 13th century had everything to do with King John's mismanagement and nothing to do with the Crusades. Right. Yeah. If there's anything we can maybe blame Richard for, it's not producing an heir, which wasn't his fault, but John was definitely a disaster for Christendom and for England. Yeah. This is a super chat from Chris. Thank you, Chris. Did Frederick's death and Philip? Well, we already got to that though. So thank you, Chris.
Yeah, we did that one. Yeah.
All right. This is an interesting question. Weren't the Byzantines also supposed to supply the kingdom with troop supplies, one of the many promises they didn't keep?
No, at this point, they were actually allied with Saladin. It's even worse. They had actually done a deal.
Right.
They were part of why, they should have been supplying. You're right. They should have, if they had not had a truce or a treaty with Saladin, they would have been providing Frederick Barbarossa with supplies all along the way, and he wouldn't have had to fight his way through, and he would have just gone through, paid for his way, and gotten all the way to the Seljuk territories easier. They did ultimately carry him across the Bosphorus, however, to be fair.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at the relationship between the Byzantines and the Crusader states. You have the Emperor Emmanuel Comnenus in kind of the mid 12th century, who was really associated himself pretty closely with the Latin culture and the Latin peoples. He had a Frankish wife, Maria.
The second
So
wife,
yeah, and you know, the Crusaders welcomed that support, and indeed, he was the overlord of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. That was an accepted part of the order according to that period.
Mhm.
So this idea that there was this inability, for these two sides to cooperate. I think, when they cooperated, it was better for the Eastern Christian world in general. That break that happens after Manuel dies is really, is really devastating, and it leads to a lot of the instability in Constantinople that results in them taking an outright hostile attitude toward the Crusaders.
And
So
then the revenge comes with the non-crusade that we call the Fourth Crusade, and the seizure of Constantinople and the establishment of a Latin Latin kingdom from Constantinople, which is
right.
drains resources away from the Latin East and is just another source of conflict in the region.
Right. So we're getting a couple of interesting questions here. This is something you and I discussed earlier, Helena, from Titans of History again. Was Richard's execution of captured soldiers justified? Was it less or more brutal than the execution of Crusaders at the aftermath of Hattin? Do you want to start with that, Helena?
I think it was justified. I don't think to say it was more or less brutal. I think that beheading people or killing people. I don't think you've had of course it was soldiers, so we're talking in both cases about soldiers. There's a horrible misconception out there that he was killing innocent civilians, women and children. Not true. It was hostages, and the murder of hostages, and it was a really ugly fate part of medieval society, but it was certainly widespread. The reason I stress how justified it was, if you look at the accounts of the continuation of Tyre, he stresses that what Saladin failed to do was deliver the hostages. They had negotiated. The reason they held 2,700 was he was supposed to free 2,700 Christians who had been taken captive. And many of the people fighting, again, this is something that was really, really emotional for the people of Outremer, less so for the Westerners, okay? Although some of the captives may have been people who had been taken captive during the siege, the bulk of them had been taken captive during the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem 2 or 3 years earlier. And for the people who had survived, getting their relatives, their brothers, their father, their sons back, their husbands back, was huge. This was what they were fighting almost more for that. This is the time that an entire order was founded, the Trinitarian order, to get captives back. Captives who were subjected to horrible abuse, which is the theme of your book, J. Steve, was a hugely emotional issue. And Saladin reneged on that. And that made the army, particularly the natives who were an important part of Richard's army, furious. So Richard, if you read the accounts of the continuation of Tyre, of the Archbishop of Tyre, that the people, he says, his army is angry. Now, if you're a general and you can't command these guys, you are dependent on them cooperating with you, and you have your troops basically furious and in revolt in the streets of Accra because Saladin's reneged. You are under huge pressure to show leadership in the sense that they want it. They did not want him to say, "Oh, that's okay, that's fine. You can keep our people. That's okay. We'll make nice with you." No, that's not how you win troops.
Right.
So Richard was under tremendous pressure to prove that he was not going to be taken in by Saladin, that he wasn't going to be pushed around by Saladin, and that he could stand up to a bully. So I don't think Richard had a lot of choice.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on some key things there. One, and there's a couple of differences between these two episodes too. Richard he didn't set out to execute these men.
Nope.
Acre was captured, and he takes the garrison prisoner, and he came to an agreement with Saladin. They discussed this. Saladin obviously was trying to foil toy with Richard, to delay him, to create problems for him by, spinning out the negotiations, by not delivering. And I mean, really, it's on Saladin. I mean, to me, it's fascinating that Saladin wasn't more concerned about the lives of these men. I mean, these were men who had really done the worst job during the whole siege of Acre. I mean, these were kind of like heroes among, from the Muslim perspective. And yet Saladin is willing to, I mean, Saladin obviously had the ability to ransom these men. This idea like, oh, he was trying to get the money together. I mean, where do we get, they negotiate.
It wasn't money. He was supposed to retire a Christian for each one.
Right. Yeah, that as well. But
and
he had the ability to do that.
He would have had to buy them from their owners, but he had the ability to do that. I agree with you 100%.
That's clearly an excuse that's designed to frustrate the process. And when you read the Muslim sources, when you read Ibn al-Athir and Ibn Shaddad, they knew what was going on. They do not. This idea that somehow this just scandalized the Muslim world and they were horrified that Richard did this, they understood why he did it. They understood exactly why he did it, and they blamed Saladin for it. And later, at the Battle of Jaffa, that's what comes out. There are people who had relatives or brothers who had been killed, who refused to fight for Saladin because the head of the garrison, al-Mashtub, his brother was this guy named al-Jana, who was at the Battle of Jaffa, and he is recorded by Ibn Shaddad as saying, "You and your sons go charge, the Lionheart. You guys do that, And so I think that Richard didn't want to do this. He did it because Saladin forced his hand, and it was kind of the only option he had. He had to say to Saladin, "Look, either you deal with me honestly, or you're going to have huge problems." And it's unfortunate that Richard was forced into that position. But again, he had a job to do, and he had to show leadership in that moment. Conversely, the killing of the Templars and the Hospitallers after Hattin was just naked brutality. This was just done, go ahead if you have a comment on that. I mean,
you can say it's gratuitous cruelty, but the fact is they had the Templars and Hospitallers were not allowed to be ransomed.
That's right. That's true.
So they had no monetary value to the South. So the only thing he could have done with them was theoretically enslave them. And this kind of men are notoriously bad slaves. They're troublemakers. You put them on the galleys, you can do some, you can get them in the mines. I mean, you can do some things to totally be so brutal that they can't. But you argue that it was actually probably more humane to just kill them and let them die a martyr's death than to torture them over years of brutal slavery. It's ugly, and he did have a choice, but it's not as though he could have ransomed them honorably.
Well, I think even given that, I mean, it's still it's more of a naked act of brutality than this. It's a very different situation from Richard's situation. If Richard, after the siege of Acre, had just lined all those guys up and massacred them, it would be more similar to what happened with Saladin. And so, but I think we've probably covered that. That's again, kind of one of those misunderstood things, because I do think people, when I've encountered people who first approach me about that particular incident, they'll say, well, I mean, he just killed all these people after the fall of Acre. It's like, no, that's not what happened at all. Not at all. So, and just as we're kind of coming to the end of our discussion here, but that's kind of the closing theme, I think, is that the history is so different than the myths and the popular ideas out there. And that's why I think that was a big motivation for Helen and I writing these two books, was to give this history its just due. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And with that, I think we've kind of come to the end of our discussion here, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us and for participating. A lot of really good questions. We couldn't get to them all, but save them for next time, and we'll get to some of those next time. And Dr. Schrader, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us for this discussion of this great history today.
My pleasure to be here. Thank you.
All right.
And thanks everybody for coming and listening to us.
Absolutely. It's always a good crowd on Real Crusades history, so we appreciate that. And if you're interested in getting these books, they are linked in the description down below. So you can find them both on Amazon, pick them up and add them to your bookshelf. And we would certainly appreciate that. All right. And with that, we will say good day or good night.